Well, welcome to day 8 of our Seeing Jesus Challenge. Today's reading was about the lame man or the sick man who was laying at the pool of Bethesda waiting to be healed. And every time I think about this man, I think about the disparity he must have felt of laying there day after day for 30-something years, every day waiting for that water to move that would prove that God was there. And then when it did move, there was nothing he could do because he was dependent on somebody else. He had to have friends that could help him get into the water. And so how many times did he see the pool move and he couldn't get there in time because there was nobody there to help him because he was totally dependent on someone else. And then what an incredible day, all of a sudden that Jesus is right there with him. And Jesus is wanting to do something in his life. But of course, he had to first of all pay attention and give Jesus the attention and not just blow Jesus off as somebody who was just coming through the area and making promises he couldn't keep. And eventually he had to take Jesus at his word. Jesus told him, take your mat and get up and walk. And, you know, that took a measure of faith for him to even try to stand up because that's not something he had done in a long, long time. And yet he did it. He acted on faith. And when I think about those two things, I think, you know, that can be true of us too. How many times do we sit around waiting for God to show up, hoping that God will reveal himself in our circumstance? Even in our worship, how many times do we go to worship and we hope that we experience God and we want to experience God and we want to feel something in our worship, but how many times do we miss it not because God wasn't there and because God didn't move, but because we were dependent on somebody else and instead of looking for God ourselves? You know, I hear it all the time. People say, well, I didn't get anything out of worship today because the preacher didn't challenge me. He wasn't a very good speaker or whatever the excuse might be. Or I hear people say, well, you know, I didn't get anything out of worship because I didn't like the music that we sang. Or we sang contemporary music and I like hymns. Or we sang hymns and I like contemporary music. And so I just didn't get anything out of it. And what we're ultimately saying is, God, we want to see you, but we're dependent on other people getting us there instead of looking for you ourselves. The truth is that every time a sermon is preached, as long as God's word is preached, God has something to say. And it doesn't matter if the sermon's good or bad, we can still hear God in the message. And it doesn't matter whether we like the songs or don't like the songs. If we're singing them to God, then we can experience God in the midst of them. And so we're not so much really revealing anything about God. We're revealing the weaknesses of ourselves when we say, I can only experience God if other people get it right. Our walk with God, our relationship with God is our responsibility. And then I think about this. How many times are we sitting there watching and waiting and hoping for God to show up? And he's right there. He's right there in our midst. He's just waiting for us to give him our attention, to give him our focus. That's the value of worship, is when we worship, when we get together on Sunday morning or Wednesday night or whatever it is, it's a few minutes where we stop from the busyness of life, where God has often gotten pushed to the background, and we give God our undivided attention and say, okay, God, we want to make sure we see you, and we want to make sure that we hear you. But we also have to be ready. If God's going to show up and God's going to speak, we have to be ready to say, God, whatever it is you want to say to me today, I'm going to do it. Even before you speak, even before you ask, I'm going to keep your word and follow your directions. So here's the challenge for today. Don't just sit around waiting for God to show up through other people. Look for God in your life, and you seek after a relationship with him. Give him your attention and be willing to act on faith on anything he calls you to do. Have a great day in God.